My name is Mackenzie Wheeler, and I chose to present on decreasing methane emissions in cattle. It's no secret that cows release methane, which contributes to greenhouse gases across the world. With the growing world population, the amount of livestock, especially grazing cattle, has also increased in order to meet the growing food demands. Methane is a natural byproduct of these cattle, so the amount that is released grows as the population of cattle increases. In order to adapt to these growing populations and reduce greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere, mitigation strategies are being studied to knock back the methane emissions from cattle. The main strategies that have been studied revolve around the diet. Reducing emissions is important to not only the environment, but it also promotes sustainability of the industry as a whole. Methane is a natural product of fermentation that we can never completely eliminate, so we should make strides to try and reduce it the best that we can. But production efficiency and methane emissions almost go hand in hand. So if you're decreasing methane emissions, then you're probably also increasing production efficiency. One of the first dietary changes that I looked into that I found interesting was the idea of adding nitrates into the diet instead of urea as a source of non-protein nitrogen. One study that I looked at was using grazing cattle in northern Australia, and they found that nitrates actually lowered the amount of protozoa in the rumen that produce hydrogen that is then used by methanogens. So this may be one pathway that it helps to reduce the production of methane, and the nitrates appeared to lower the total amount by about 23%. It is giving the hydrogen an alternate route that does not include the methanogens, while giving an ammonia source for the microbes to grow, and has been proven to be beneficial across multiple studies. The alternate place for H2 in the rumen comes from nitrate to nitrite, since it's favored over CO2 to CH4 since it produces more energy. But this may not be a long-term solution and has its own set of drawbacks. One of the first things that you have to be aware of is nitrite toxicity. You have to be very careful how much they are given and how frequently it's given to avoid toxicity. Nitrate is reduced to nitrite when it's broken down into ammonia that is used for protein synthesis in the rumen. However, too much nitrite being in the system and exceeding what can be turned into ammonia can cause the production of methemoglobin, which essentially means if concentrations get too high, the blood cannot transport oxygen, leading to death. In the Northern Australia study, they found that methemoglobin concentrations stayed low enough if the animal ate the nitrate at a slower rate and over many different sessions, so it remained relatively safe. Along with this, it was shown to cause a decrease in live weight gain in some instances, which negatively impacts production and efficiency, as well as being expensive in more than one way. You need a lot more of it than urea to get the same nitrogen content, and it also is more expensive. It's over double the price of urea per cow per day. Plus, to avoid toxicity, it needs to be consumed more slowly and monitored to make sure no single animal gets too much. So, the time and management that goes into the animals would also increase. Even though nitrate has been proven to reduce methane emissions in cattle, even if it is deemed totally safe, it will be difficult to convince people to adopt the idea simply because of the lingering cost. Another strategy I took a look at was the addition of lipids and oils into the diet to cut back on methane emissions. It's been proven that lipids will decrease CH4 emissions. Lipids provide organic matter to the diet that isn't fermented inside the rumen, so that means it's not available for methane production. They can also stop the bacteria and protozoa that actually produce the hydrogen that the methanogens need to produce the methane, and end up in some cases actually being toxic to the methanogens themselves. One study with dairy cattle showed that the lipid supplementation decreased methane emissions by 9%, but it also had a negative effect on dry matter intake. But, since it did not have an effect on the fat-corrected milk, this actually means that the cows became more feed efficient with the lipid supplementation. With decreased intake but steady or increased production, this means that there was actually an inevitable drop in methane. Like nitrates, lipid supplementation also has its own set of drawbacks. The main thing to keep in mind with lipids is the risk of the animal not getting enough fiber. Fiber is essential for the health and proper functioning of the rumen, so to cut down on the negative effects, you can supplement with whole oil seeds, since they release the oil more slowly into the rumen as they are broken down. However, they are more mild in terms of dropping methane emission. It has also been shown that the effects that the lipids have on methane production is only temporary. One theory about why this happens is it is possible that the rumen learns to adapt. The microbes may actually adapt to the oil, and over time it essentially reverses the decrease in methane until it is relatively ineffective. So, lipid and oil supplementation is very effective in the short term, but over the course of several weeks, the benefits drop off and is no longer as effective. Concentrate versus mixed diets and forage was also a big contender for management of methane. It seems to be a widely accepted concept and that concentrates will produce lower levels of methane than a mixed diet. Increasing concentrates will also drop the pH of the rumen, which leads to a decrease in methanogen numbers, which also decreases the methane emission. It's said that concentrate feeds may decrease emissions, especially if it's above 40% of the dry matter, but you have to make sure the rumen function is not impaired. But even so, when supplementing poor quality forage diets with concentrates still decreases methane. Cool season forages have also been shown to lower methane emissions in place of warm season grasses. Since cool season grasses carry out C3 photosynthesis, they have less lignin, less fiber, and more protein, which means it does not take as long to break them down, so they in turn produce less methane. In the diagram I have here, you can see a bit of the difference between the C3 and C4 photosynthesis. C4 plants typically have bundle sheaths as well as very thick cell walls, which makes them harder to digest. This means they will be fermented for longer, leading to a higher amount of emissions than the C3 plants. With all of this said, concentrates are expensive, so high concentrate diets are also expensive. So again, the economic factor of reducing methane emissions comes in, as well as having to properly balance the ration so that the rumen function is not altered too much by not getting enough fiber, similar to the potential risk involved with lipids. You can end up with a cow that has acidosis, so this is something you need to keep an eye on if feeding high concentrate diets. When it comes down to grasses, specifically the cool versus warm season, it all depends on where you are in the world and what time of year it is. For example, you're going to find a lot more cool season grasses in the Midwest than you will here in Georgia. They cannot survive the same here and have different growing patterns, so availability comes into play. It is interesting, though, that one study looked at how different diets would alter the rumen microbiome altogether, and they even found biomarkers for low methane emitting cattle. They were able to take this information and test different feed additives, such as tannin, and watch how it impacted methane emissions. If they can do this, then maybe they can find biomarkers for low methane production in general and select for that without the need for feed additives at all. The graph here shows a few different species they tested for in the rumen, what they expected the numbers to be, and what they actually ended up finding. A lot of them were significant, letting them be able to predict rumen populations and biomarkers. One last idea that hasn't quite been proven, but that I found interesting. Basically, the personality of the cattle can make a big difference in their methane emissions. For example, a study that I found looked at temperament and dominance traits in steers by observing their attitudes while confined in a chute as well as when out in the group to feed. And it turns out that feeding behavior is linked to feed efficiency and to methane emissions. Frequent meals were linked to lower emissions. In the more temperamental steers, feed intake was lower and dominant steers eat more frequently. According to this research, feed efficiency increases with longer feeding times and methane decreases with more frequent meals. So, if you can decrease the dominant steers creating the competition at the feeder, you can increase feed efficiency and lower emissions. So, you breed for calmer cattle and kill two birds with one stone. This seemed to be a relatively new concept, so I did not find much other research on it, but it does make sense, and I'm interested to see if any developments happen with this in the future, and also it seems like it would be something that may take multiple generations to really see a true impact across the industry. Overall, I believe that the best way to go about reducing methane emissions is to try and implement more than one mitigating strategy. Looking at combining strategies is the best bet to get the optimal decrease in emissions, and it may be the best way to save everyone's wallet. Maybe go through cycles of using lipid supplementation along with C3 grasses when available. Maybe try out different types of oils and change them frequently so that the rumen does not fully adapt. Maybe use a combination of C3 forages and higher concentrates in feed. The overarching issue here is money and convenience. It all comes back to whether or not you can get people to implement the practices, even if they work wonders. People across the world are not going to be inclined to implement new practices to reduce emissions until they are both efficient and cost-effective, while at the same time not negatively impacting production. Finding this balance seems to be one of the most difficult parts. And these are my references.